Hello and welcome to our third podcast debate of the fall 2020 season. Thank you so much for joining us. We were delighted to have everybody join us for our past two debates, our first one on podcasts and our last debate on cancel culture. Tonight we have a very relevant and pointed issue. Tonight we are, as you can see by the screens behind us, going to be discussing the election. And specifically the resolution tonight will be our election system is fair, not rigged. We'll talk a little bit about why it is that we've chosen to phrase our resolution specifically in this way. We have two excellent teams of debaters arguing both the affirmative and the negative on this debate. Please do yourself a favor and vote before and after. The winners of tonight's debate, as always, will be decided not by who gets the most votes, but by who changes the audience's mind the most. So that requires you to vote before and after. You can vote by clicking the link either underneath the video on Facebook or in our profile description on Instagram, depending on where it is that you're watching this. And if you're watching this on YouTube after we have gone live, then you're welcome to look into the description there. We'll also have a voting tally there. That said, speaking of our Instagram and our Facebook and our YouTube, please make sure that you like and subscribe our pages. That's the best way to get information about future debates, including our upcoming our final two broadcasts for the semester. On November 5th, we'll be discussing gun rights with the resolution, "Gun rights are essential to a free society," and we'll be hosting our distinguished guest, Stanley Fish, on November 12th for an hour-long conversation on free speech. Tonight, however, we have an absolutely fantastic opening speaker. Tonight, we'll be talking to Jack Noland of Represent Us. Jack Noland is a research expert for Represent Us and has been looking very deeply into the issues of how we can avoid things like election fraud and how we can make sure that our elections are as sound as possible and how we can get out the word to make sure people are voting. So that said, Jack Noland, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So like I said, we want to talk a little bit about the importance of our elections. And I think I spoke to you about this. One of the reasons why we're phrasing our resolution like this is we're hearing a lot of complaints about a rigged system, about the problems with our election from both Republicans and Democrats. Usually Republicans are discussing things like mail-in ballots or voter fraud, and on the other side, Democrats are usually talking about voter suppression and voter ID laws, and both sides tend to talk about gerrymandering. So what we wanted to do was kind of talk about why it is and how it is that people should still be going out to vote despite the fact that we're hearing so much about this. So if you could talk a little bit about what your group does, what Represent Us does, and what you've been dealing with in terms of the issues of getting people to get out to vote.
Sure, yeah. Well, thanks again for having me. So as was mentioned, I do research for Represent Us. We're a national nonpartisan anti-corruption organization that prides itself in bringing together the two different groups of people that are, sort of crying foul right now. So we have progressives, conservatives, everyone in between, with the goal of passing powerful state and local laws to reform our democracy and make our governance work for everyone. We think it's important to work at the state and local level because all it takes is one look at Congress to know that it's really challenging to make reform into the current sort of gridlock, hyper-partisan environment that we have, but we see broad interest across the political spectrum in making change. We take a broad view of these issues, so we work on everything from electoral reform to voting access, lobbying and ethics, redistricting and gerrymandering, and money in politics. I came into the space through a campaign finance focus, but it didn't take long to sort of see how much broader and more complex the issues are. And so as a result, this year has been, I think, in every aspect, incredibly challenging, not least of which it's been a challenge for our elections and our voting systems. One of the things that we've tried to do at Represent Us in sort of addition to our voting reform work is to try to provide people with the resources that they need to participate. Excuse me.
Like what?
So we think it's super important that people are able to make a plan to be able to vote. You hear that all the time, I'm sure. You make a plan, you make sure that your friends and family have a plan. But one of the reasons we think that's so important this year is that the pandemic has upended everything, including elections, and more states than ever offer people the opportunity to vote by mail or vote absentee this year. Arizona is, of course, a state that has pretty broad absentee rights, but a lot of states are sort of stepping up to that. And so as a result, there are going to be a lot more changes to systems that people know. The polling place may not be where it always was. And so we encourage people to go directly to their election administrators, find out what's changed, how they can access their ballot if they need to, how they can send it back, and make sure that their vote's counted.
So one thing, I hear you mentioning things like the gridlock in Washington and and things like gerrymandering, but you're also talking about making sure that we go to our election officials. So I'd love to hear this because I know that we're going to talk about this in the debate. Would you describe what's going on in Washington in terms of the gridlock? Is it more often the problems that we see in terms of our election system? Is it more often trying to actively prevent voters from being able to express their voice? Or would you say that it's more a laissez-faire attitude towards fixing problems that we have?
It's a really good question. I think it's a mixed bag, which is an unsatisfying answer, I realize, but in some sense there is a long and infamous tradition of outright voter suppression and intimidation in this country. And there are also cases of complacency and a lack of interest in reform because it suits people who are in power. And so I do think, it's hard to paint with a broad brush, but we do see both sides. And I think that's why it is so important for people to sort of plan early, figure out how they're going to approach the system, and sort of make sure they're able to get their vote counted.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. And so one other thing I wanted to talk about is in terms of, you mentioned talking to our election officials. How do people get in touch? How do we connect voters to the people who are in power, who are actually looking to make sure that their vote can count, rather than those who are attempting to not?
Yeah, I mean, so there are, in every state, we have election administrators at various levels. You can search out who the election administrators are in your state. A lot of them will have either hotlines for if you're having challenges voting or challenges approaching the system. You can reach out directly that way. Some will have, social media, email, like we're starting to get into the 21st century with election administrations, which is great. But one of the other things too is there are a lot of third-party groups that are, have taken it upon themselves to provide these resources, centralize them, and try to get people the shortcuts they need, because it can be a tricky system to navigate.
So if that's the case, so let's talk a little bit about referring directly to how we're sort of talking about this resolution. So what aspects would you say, if you had to characterize any aspects of the system as rigged or unfair? I mean, I know that we've talked about voter suppression a little bit. Which aspects do you think are the fairest aspects of our election system?
It's a good question. I think by and large, the votes that are cast are counted appropriately. I think by and large, we should have faith in sort of the results of our elections as being true to how they're being cast. There are certainly issues with how people access the voting system. But by and large, election administrators are public servants who are committed to upholding democracy and counting the votes properly. So I think that's one place where we should be heartened. I would also say that I tend to think that the information that we get from those people tends to be relatively trustworthy. I think one of the concerns this year especially will be the swirl of disinformation, especially after Election Day, if we don't have a clear winner at that time. And so I think I would encourage people to look to the election officials who count the ballots, who release the official count, before looking to, sort of your news outlets, your more partisan actors when looking for an accounting of what's happened.
So I'm glad that you're pointing to the irregularities, or at least the sort of anomaly that this upcoming election will be, largely due to the fact that obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic and a lot of mail-in ballots are coming in. specifically because we have such a broad undergraduate college-aged audience who might be voting for the first time. Can you speak a little bit to how it is that this election differs from other elections in the past, just so that no one who's voting this time thinks that this is like typical of how it is that elections usually run?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think it's exciting. It's an exciting time to be a first-time voter. The stakes certainly seem high. I would say the biggest change is, as we talked about before, more and more states are allowing people to vote by mail. We're seeing huge vote by mail usage, application return rates. And so I think absentee voting, vote by mail, et cetera, kind of one and the same, can be kind of a challenging system to approach at first. There are often, the ballot will come with multiple envelopes and a set of instructions. And I think it sounds kind of blasé, but following the instructions is really important. The vast majority of states, it's something like 45, offer a ballot tracking system. So just like you can track your Amazon purchase as it comes to your door, you can track your ballot both coming to your house or wherever you're voting from, and also going back. And if you do have questions, I do think it's important to reach out to those trusted third-party groups, to reach out to election officials, because they are there to help you sort of navigate the system.
Yeah, it is. I find that interesting, and I'd actually, my last sort of area that I want to talk to you about, it's interesting that you point out that, following directions really is kind of the most important thing to do, but it's really hard to make that sound kind of sexy, right? It's sort of hard to like give that like the hard sell. What is it that both Represent Us is doing, and that other people who are trying to motivate, especially younger voters, can do to really fire them up and make sure that they're as excited as possible and as enthusiastic as possible to go and have their voice heard when they vote?
It's a really good question. I think you have to reach people where they are, which is why Represent Us and a bunch of other groups really focus our efforts on social media and on the sort of digital media, which is where people are consuming most of their news. Getting people just the facts, I think, is really important. Preparing people, I think when people see what their ballot is going to look like, it's helpful because it kind of demystifies it. Talking about the process, both, returning the ballot and then what will happen after, how it's verified, how it's counted, how those results, eventually filter up to the presidency, essentially. I think that's all really important. We try to have fun with it at Represent Us. In Pennsylvania, not to get too sidetracked, there's an issue with what are called naked ballots. So there's a secrecy sleeve that comes with your ballot to ensure that the administrators can verify it without sort of revealing who you voted for. And so naked ballots are ballots that are returned without that secrecy sleeve and are at risk of being disqualified. And so one of the things that Represent Us did was try to get, celebrities who are talking about the issue of naked ballots while naked. And we saw a sort of a profound sort of interest in this. I think celebrities draw clicks and
that'll do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I hear your point, and I think there are a lot of these issues that are complex and convoluted. And I think the barrier for entry can be hard for people to bridge. But I think realizing the system is set up in most cases to try to make sure that you are able to cast your vote and have your voice heard is a good place to start. And it's how we start to break down that apathy.
And to return to your earlier point, and this is a good probably note to end on and to transition into our debate, as you said, the unfair sort of part of the system, or the suppressed part of the system, has nothing to do with actually the vote that you cast. It's making sure that you are getting to the poll and getting your vote in there. So largely it sounds like your main message here is to make sure that you actually vote, that if you do vote, that it's going to get counted and it's going to work.
In the vast majority of cases, that's what happens. Voter fraud is the statistic that I love is voter fraud is less likely than being hit by lightning. So just as we walk around outside every day without much fear of being hit by lightning, we can expect our voting system to deliver fair and accurate results.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jack. I really, really appreciate you coming tonight. And good luck. Obviously, you have a very, very eventful 12 days ahead of you, but We wish you luck, and thank you so much for your hard work getting out the vote.
Thanks so much. We're looking forward to the debate.
Excellent. And discuss this resolution, which again you can vote on by clicking either below in the Facebook description or in our Instagram description, or again, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can go ahead and look in the description of the video, and you can vote both before and after. No one has heard any of our debaters argue yet, so you're more than welcome to cast your pre-debate on this resolution. Our election system is fair, not rigged. If you are in the affirmative, click affirmative. If you are in the negative, click the negative. You're always welcome to click not sure, because I'm sure there are plenty of undecided voters out there on this issue, if not necessarily on the presidential election itself. Tonight, again, we have 4 definitely qualified debaters. They've been working really hard, and we're going to, as always, start with the affirmative. And let's start with the affirmative. Please, we have Kat Lewis, right? Kat, you're opening.
Yes.
Kat Lewis will be opening for the affirmative on the resolution. Our election system is fair, not rigged. Kat Lewis.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I would like to preface by explaining that when we're discussing whether the system is rigged or not, the agreed upon definition of rigged between all of us is something that has been fraudulently manipulated by someone to get their desired outcome. We argue that the system itself cannot be rigged and is not. Our election system was created to be fair, and the federal government in past decades has taken many measures to keep it so. Many of you hopefully already know about how the United States voting and election system works, but for those who may be unfamiliar or who may be a little out of touch if it's been a while since you've taken a government class, here's a brief refresher. Basically, the way that almost every election in the US works, except for the presidential ones, is that whoever receives the most vote is the one who wins and is elected to the position. The presidential elections differ in that they rely on the Electoral College system to determine the winner. The Electoral College is the system in which each state gets a certain number of electors based on its total number of representatives in Congress. Each elector casts one electoral vote. Following the general election, there are a total of 538 electoral votes, and the candidate that gets more than half, which is 270, wins the election. These electors only come together every 4 years to cast their electoral vote for the president. Each state and their laws decide how electors will vote. For the most part, electors typically vote for the popular vote in their state, and 32 states and DC actually have laws binding their electors to do so. This year, in Chiafalo versus Washington, the Supreme Court ruled that states are free to enforce laws that bind electors to voting for the popular vote in their state, so this is constitutional to do so. The NEG will tell you that the Electoral College system is unfair and creates a disproportionate strength to some states' electoral votes over others. They will say that states such as Wyoming, which gets 3 electoral votes, have more pull to their votes than more populous states such as California or New York, which get 55 and 29 electoral votes respectively. However, electoral votes are given in part due to population sizes in each state per the census every 10 years. The Electoral College was created with the intent to protect such small and less populous states like Wyoming, Rhode Island, and Vermont so that more populous states would not simply dominate the entire election. If the country did switch to a popular vote for the president, there would still be claims of rigging and fraud and overall inaccuracy and distrust no matter who wins. This will not fix the problems that we are currently facing. The election system itself was made to be fair, and it is. It is the elected politicians who make it unfair and skew things in their favor. Even if the presidential election were to be decided by popular vote, presidential candidates would still only be campaigning mainly in divided states, and particularly in large, dense cities, because those votes would still be more important to them due to the larger populations than in smaller states. Presidential candidates of both parties have limited time and money, so they would be foolish to waste their time and resources on anywhere but the most densely populated urban centers. This is where the largest concentration of voters are, so racking up votes in these areas would be the overwhelming focus of any election, leaving the vast number of more rural areas in each state completely ignored. The Electoral College makes sure that those rural and sparsely populated states are still represented, allowing for a more equitable elections and voting process. A very popular debate that often occurs around election years is one regarding gerrymandering, and many use the argument that it is racially based and meant to disenfranchise certain populations. We, the AF, would like to make it clear that racial gerrymandering is actually illegal per a ruling from the Supreme Court in 1995. But even before that, racial gerrymandering was the practice of redistricting in order to increase minority congressional electoral representation. The main goal now of gerrymandering is to reflect collective interests among communities, which often leads to redistricting according to populations of a certain party in any given area. States do have the option to choose nonpartisan commissions to draw their maps and determine districts, and 21 states use such commissions. Some argue that districts should simply be drawn with straight lines, but that is completely illogical from the standpoint of representation. An article written by John Sides and Eric McGee said it best: "Good districts are about people, not polygons." While these methods may, to some, not seem the best way to go about things, remember that these are the officials elected into office by each state per the popular vote. These outcomes are not due to the system itself, but rather showcase how you can have a real impact by exercising your right to vote. These congressional representatives and senators in your state legislature are voted on entirely by constituents, which is why it is important to make informed voting decisions. The election system has established itself to be a fair method in which our government officials are elected and is not one which can be rigged by any one person or party. For these reasons, we highly encourage you to vote AF, that our election system is fair and is not rigged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kat. And opening up the debate on the side of the negative, we have Knife.
Pat and I would like to again thank our guest speaker, Jack Nolan, our moderator, Ted McLoof, the affirmative team, Kat and Vincent, and of course the wonderful viewers at home for providing us with a platform to discuss the intricacies of our electoral system. The negation would like to first start by providing some key definitions that we think will frame today's debate. First, we define the electoral system as the components that determine how an election is run and the declaration of a winner. This includes the Electoral College, campaign funding, and more broadly, other practices that have the capacity to amplify or suppress the interests of the American public. Next, we define foundational as denoting an underlying basis or principle, which is synonymous with systemic. And finally, the distinction between an equitable practice and an equal practice is centered around a distribution of resources, where equity ensures that marginalized groups are represented in ways that fit their specific needs, and equality guarantees that all groups are represented in the same way. The negation argues that the electoral system is rigged due to the foundational inequities that prohibit the fair representation of the public. Our first point is that the Electoral College was created with perverted intentions that sought to diminish the influence that common citizens can have on major elections. The choice of who should be entrusted with choosing our nation's leader came down to Congress and the common man. The compromise was the Electoral College, a system put in place to ensure that only those deemed educated enough had the power to elect the president of our country. But when we consider the implications of this system, we found that in order for there to be worthy people, there had to be people that were unworthy enough to vote. These unworthy people were simply those who weren't landowners, but these landowners were all white men, meaning there was no platform advocacy for those who don't fit within that demographic. The negative effects of this system are still evident in today's voting pool, but we'll further explore that later. When we analyze the Electoral College from a partisan perspective, we find even more staunch admissions of the suppression that is so ingrained within the systems. Our current system allows for superdelegates. These are former party leaders who ignore the outcome of primary elections, popular vote, and vote for the presidential candidate of their personal choice. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the former chair of the DNC and Florida Congresswoman, admitted the existence of superdelegates is to ensure that big-name elected officials are not in a position in which they have to run against grassroots activists. Take into consideration that the Public Religion Research Institute found in 2016 that 61% of survey respondents said neither political party reflected their opinions today. The argument can be made that these very grassroots candidates are who the American public feel best represent them. So who is the system representative of? We can answer this question by turning to the places that majority party candidates receive their funding. The very existence of political action committees is to allow for unlimited fundings from private corporations, individuals, and unions. And while they cannot directly fund candidates, this distorts and prevents any solvency to issues found within the Electoral College. What we find is that the purpose of super PACs is to finance independent expenditures and other independent political activity. This independent political activity presents itself as overtly negative and confusing campaign advertisements meant to slander oppositional candidates rather than provide citizens with the vital information to be informed voters. On top of this, the donors that fund the campaigns of big-name candidates distort political agendas further, aligning them with the goals of the common citizen. Finally, when we bring the debate towards the spectrum of local elections, we can see the multiple examples of tools meant to suppress the American public. The practice of gerrymandering draws boundaries of legislative districts so that as many seats as possible are likely to be won by a party's candidates. The namesake of the system, 5th Vice President Elbridge Gerry, claimed the evils we experience flow from an excess of democracy. On the issue of fraudulence within elections, the requirement of home addresses or photo IDs creates the obvious issue of disenfranchisement of poor voters, especially when we consider the hidden price tag attached to the fulfillment of these requirements. For these reasons and more, we negate the resolution. Our election system is fair, not rigged.
Thank you very much, Naya. Okay, so after our first round, what I'm hearing from the AF is largely that they agree that there are certainly problems in the way that our elections sometimes happen, but they're saying that the problems are not within the system. The system itself actually is fair, it's been made to be fair, and that if there's anything that's making it problematic, it's the people who are in power. Sort of a guns don't kill people, people kill people kind of argument. On the neg, what we're hearing is that the system itself actually was created by those in power to make sure that those in power stay in power. They're pointing to the initial writers of the entire system itself. They point to the people who are in power today, like W. Wasserman Schultz, discussing things like superdelegates and the problematic issue of our primaries. The good thing that I will say is that neither team, in fact, both teams seem as though they are encouraging people to go out and vote in order to change whatever problems they see. So I'm glad that nobody is saying, screw it, everything sucks, stay home on election day. But that said, I want to point my first question over to the AF based on something that the neg said. It does sound as though there is a very clear, distinct difference between the two sides on this. The affirmative seems like you guys are arguing that the system itself actually is made to be fair. What do you say to the negative charges that the system itself actually was made to keep people who are in power, and to not necessarily trust the average common voter?
So I think in response to that, what we have to see is that they used evidence that was when the voting system was first created. And as we see now in the modern day, like, you aren't a white landowner. Those aren't the only people that vote. You have minorities that vote all across the board. And what we see is that our election system, because of how it is designed and built, it's able to adapt and overcome any sort of perceived challenges that come about throughout our history.
Okay. Pat, do you want to respond to that? The idea that, yes, there were problems from the outset, but that we've overcome most of them, and that we are able to sort of smooth out the problems in our system itself?
I'll take this one. I think my partner's having a couple technical difficulties. But I would say that the system was created with perverted intentions, and that the flawed system hasn't been fixed. It has been reestablished, and it's just shown in different ways. So it can still be seen that minority groups, poor people, people who aren't white, are still disenfranchised with things like fewer polling locations, voter ID laws, the fact that they're subject to waiting in long lines where they're then forced to choose to go to work or to vote. And because of all these reasons, it still shows that the people in power have been valued since the beginning of our electoral system and until now.
So I'm glad that you bring up the fact that about voter ID laws, because I understand that has been a major issue in the past. But actually, the National Bureau of Economic Research came out with a study spanning over the course of the 2008 to 2016 election system cycles. And what they ended up finding was that with the institution of voter ID laws, it actually had no negative effect on registration or turnout all across the board. Initially, I will say that when these laws are often enacted, voters often are caught off guard as a result, and so they don't act correspondingly to ensure that they have proper ID. And even then, what we've seen in the past, there was a recent Pew Institute that found that 77% of registered voters regardless of their political affiliation, actually backed voter ID laws. And another poll found that 80% just between whites and minorities, they both showed the same strength for support among voter ID laws. So I think what we have to focus on here in this debate is on whether or not the restrictions actually hamper someone from voting. And I don't think that's the case. If anything, voter ID laws strengthen our ability to function as a proper democracy and to ensure that there aren't things such as voter fraud or other issues of the sorts, making sure that your vote is verified as a voter.
So is the suggestion there that, I mean, because there are obviously widespread complaints about suppressive voter ID laws. Is the affirmative suggesting that that no voter ID laws are suppressive? That any kind of extent that we make, that always voter ID laws are all right, or are we suggesting that most of the time that they're okay, that they're at least well intended?
So I think they're well-intended. I mean, no one has an issue with having to present an ID to drive a vehicle, to purchase alcohol at the age of 21. Those are things that you do on an everyday basis, whereas you vote once every 4 years if it's a presidential election. What's important to understand here is that these things help strengthen our democracy, not necessarily hamper your ability to vote at all.
Okay, let me turn a question over to the negative team. So the negative team, if you guys can speak a little to this, it does sound like your opponents are conceding that there are some issues for sure, but they do seem to suggest that we have the ability to overcome most of the issues that are in the system. That the system itself is whatever's problematic about it is fixable. So would you agree that we are able to overcome those problems, or are you suggesting that the system itself is broken beyond repair?
I think that in terms of acknowledging whether or not the system is broken doesn't mean that we can't fix the system. The negation stance on today's debate is that the system is systemically broken. Providing solvency for that would look for, in our world, like voters voting for those representatives that feel best represent the platform of fixing the broken system that we've created, right? So I think that you can still have systemically ingrained issues and work towards fixing them. So I think we'd agree that we do think you can fix the issues.
So then let's return to the specific definition that you guys gave of the concept of a rigged system. Because it's not just a matter of there being some things that are problematic, but specifically it sounds like you guys are suggesting that rigged means that it's actually consciously being set up so that certain people, certain citizens are going to have more of an advantage and more of an opportunity than other citizens. So can the neg talk a little bit more about what it is that you see, not just problematically, but specifically rigged about the system, and again, how we can overcome those things?
Absolutely. I'm super glad you asked. So within the Electoral College, just as Naya said in the constructive speech, right, we saw that the reason it was put in place is because our founders believed that there were people that were qualified to vote and people that weren't qualified to vote. And the very fact that this belief that existed was that people thought that there wasn't qualifications, or there were people that were qualified to vote, but some that weren't, is an example of a systemic problem that our system was based off of. And this has continued throughout history, even to today. We still have the Electoral College, even though we have a much better grasp on educating all citizens, as well as ensuring that, at the bare minimum, we have better access to education than we did, say, 200 years ago. Additionally, if we take a look at other contentions that we bring up in our speech, such as the Electoral College or even voting laws, the idea that there is fraudulent voters and these voters can prove that they aren't fraudulent by providing evidence of a housing address or even a photo ID shows that, disenfranchisement of the poor, coming from the fact that not everyone has these things, is evident as well. And especially in that, we're kind of essentially calling these things fraudulent.
So yeah, let me turn that back to the F then. I mean, it sounds like the neg is specifically pushing back on the idea that voter ID laws are completely sensible and well-intentioned, but the negative does seem like they're suggesting that it does discount people who don't necessarily have an address. It takes a lot of power away from the poor and powerless. Can you guys discuss that a little bit about why it is that you disagree with that?
So, Kat, you can handle it if you want. I saw you just unmute.
No, you can take it.
So in terms of voter ID laws, I think what's important to understand is that there is a solution. Just as the negative Pat brought up in her comment, is that there are solutions to the problems we overcome. We had problems of landowners not of being the only ones able to vote in the past. That's not a problem anymore. You can be able to have a simple state identification card in which it has your name. You can provide things such as social security numbers in order to prove your identification as a person. And even then, there are simple solutions to this. In fact, a study from, as Forbes explained back in 2014, that the government can simply start issuing state photo ID cards for election purposes. And this would only cost around $200,000 a year for states. And if you take all 50 states and do the math, that only accounts to about 10 million every single election cycle. And so I think it's important to understand this debate is that, yes, while there are problems, while it may impact some people, there is a simple solution to solve these issues. And because of there being a simple solution, that in of itself shows that our election system is fair and not rigged.
I think a major point of disagreement between the affirmative and the negative is that the negative argues that just because solutions exist to the problem doesn't mean that the problems don't inherently exist. The very fact that there has to be solutions in the first place, if anything, goes into the negative's definition that the system is rigged and must be fixed. If the system was fair and was rigged, we would argue that the solutions wouldn't need to be put in place. But going back to the point of voter ID laws, while we do acknowledge that there are solutions that can be put in place, the issue is we have to put forth the effort of encouraging these state legislators to enact these policies that would provide these citizens with the voter identification laws that Vincent's talking about. And while that's a valid point, when we bring about the issues that we talked about in our constructive speech that exist in the election system as a whole, this is a much more difficult task than what the affirmative would like for you to believe. Additionally, unfortunately, it's not so easy to acquire these to fulfill these requirements that it takes to not be a fraudulent voter. But I'd like to go ahead and let Naya explain that further.
Yeah, so I would just like to point out that I think my opponent Vincent is discounting how simple it is to get things like a voter ID if you're not someone who has permanent address, or someone who maybe doesn't have access to get back and forth to government buildings to get the physical ID, or who doesn't carry around, they don't have access to their personal identification to prove that they are who they are, or they don't have the low amount of money that it takes that you still have to pay to get an ID. So I think that my opponent is discounting the people that are truly disenfranchised by this by saying, well, they're not the majority, but these are still a large group of people who aren't being represented and haven't been represented since the beginning of the electoral system because of things like voter ID laws. I thought it was interesting that my opponent brought up that when voter ID laws were enacted, that basically the same amount of people were still voting and that there was no problem. But I would use that statistic to argue that that's the exact reason that they were created, was to hold these systems in place that continued these disenfranchised people from not being able to vote.
Well, I want to be able to give the AF a chance to respond, but I do also want to switch topics from voter ID laws to something else in just a minute. Does the AF want to respond?
It's interesting to us that you're not really coming up with any statistics of your own at all. You're just kind of hammering back this back and forth of what do these people do? What do these people do? We've given you that answer, and you're not actually really telling us what specific voter ID laws are preventing these people from doing those things, and kind of what are the statistics of the people that are truly impacted by this? Like, yes, it is important to get every single person's vote out there, but I believe you might be making a bigger deal out of this than it is. I'm not saying that it is, but in any way, a small problem. However, I would love to see some statistics from you guys about those things.
And we also have a piece of evidence from 538 that they did survey data, and they actually found that voter ID laws are likely to galvanize people to actually vote. So if anything, by recognizing that there are voter ID laws in place, what ends up happening a lot of the times is that people now get informed that, oh, hey, I need to get a form of identification, and they actually go and register to vote. And we've actually seen in the short term, like, people go out and start voting because of these voter ID laws being put in place. So if anything, we're allowing more people to have a higher voter turnout as a result of voter ID laws.
Pat, you're welcome to give a quick follow-up response, and then I want to change topics.
Awesome. So in terms of responding to the affirmative, I think it's important not only to reference how many people are voting, but exactly who is voting. So actually, the ACLU reports, and I think it's 2016, that about 11% of US citizens lack the ID required to vote. And like Naya's argued, this costs money, estimated from $75 to $175 that the lower class often doesn't have to spend on something like a voter ID. And, you know, of course, taking into consideration the homeless population of these states that have these laws, we can't expect them to be able to vote if they don't have a home address. Voter ID laws actually reduce voter turnout, according to a 2004 GAO study. These stricter voter ID laws have been found to reduce voter turnout by 2 to 3%, which translates to tens of thousands of votes lost in a single state. Also, it disproportionately affects minority voters. So once again, we return to the question of who is voting. Up to 25% of African American citizens lack the requirements to be able to vote of the voting age, compared to only 8% of whites and other racial minorities. So when you ask for statistics on the affirmative team, you know, I'd say that we, the nation, can provide plenty and not only show how it affects the numbers, but the minority groups that it's impacting as well.
So let's switch topics really quickly and talk about the Electoral College and the way that things like superdelegates function in our primary system. I would say, again, turning over to the half who have suggested so far that it's not the system itself, it actually is the people who are in power who sometimes can corrupt the system. It would seem as though things like things like the Electoral College are in place in some ways to, as we've talked about so far, make sure that populist candidates don't end up making it through. We saw something similar to that in the primaries this year with Joe Biden end up losing a couple primaries and then ended up sort of just sweeping as soon as the entire party got behind him. And it seemed as if the party's sort of picking the candidate rather than the people picking the candidates. We saw that in 2016 with the popular vote. The candidate who won the popular vote didn't necessarily end up winning the election. So can the AF talk a little bit about why it is that you don't see that as a systemic problem, and why it is that you still see that as a fair system?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? My headphones cut out a little bit.
I think I'm just asking, why is it that you guys are arguing that it's not the system itself that's unfair, but when we see people who are winning the popular vote not being elected president, or people who are winning more of the votes in primary systems not necessarily being chosen as the party's nominee, it seems like as though the party is choosing the nominee, why is that not evidence of an unfair system?
You ask a very good question. So it's not really an issue with the system, because the system is that, so in relation to like superdelegates, those are very party specific, and it's not the system itself. The Republican Party actually has no superdelegates at all. But the way the system works is in order to get the... Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Vincent, please take over.
So as with the Electoral College, what we see is it's important to understand with these votes that go into it is that as President of the United States, yes, while it's nice that you have the popular vote, we are also a country that is 50 states. I'll quote Joe Biden from tonight's presidential debate right before this, is that it's not about a blue state or a red state, it's about the United States of America. You have to take into account that you have states like North Dakota, Iowa, Oklahoma, whatever, these smaller states that have smaller delegate portions, that their voice still counts as part of the country's electoral college. Whereas you have states such as New York or California in which you have these mega supercenters in which people are densely packed into urban areas. That's not necessarily the fault of the election system itself. That's geography playing into the matters of itself. But what's important to understand with this is that as president, you have to represent everyone in the United States. You can't just represent these major urban population centers, and that's the great benefit of the Electoral College. It allows people to be able to have a voice no matter what state they come from, and allows everyone to be represented. If you were to get rid of the Electoral College and just focus on a popular vote, as the New York Times explained last year, all you would have is that just candidates focusing on those mega cities, such as New York, such as Los Angeles, and that's not fixing the system. You're giving those people that don't live inside of these cities no sort of representation, no sort of voice, because candidates are just going to focus on the mega centers because they know if they win those areas, they'll win the election.
Senator, want to respond?
Naya, do you want to, or would you rather I do it?
You can.
Okay, so as a quick response to Vincent's last point, sorry, just a second. When he makes the claim that if we were to abolish the Electoral College, we would simply see less candidate turnout into these more rural areas. If we take a look at where a majority of big name candidates campaigned in 2016, we see that regardless of what system is put in place, these candidates are avoiding rural areas anyways. The New York Times reports in 2016, arguably the last year that presidential candidates were able to campaign normally, right? Presidential campaigns don't campaign in rural areas no matter what system is used, simply because there just aren't a lot of votes to be gained. If we want specific examples, 53% of campaign events for Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Mike Pence, and Tim Kaine in the 2 months before the November election were in only 4 states: Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Ohio. 87% of campaign visits by these 4 candidates were in 12 battleground states, and none of these 4 candidates went to 27 states that include almost all of rural America. So as we can see, based off this statistic alone, it becomes increasingly clear that the Electoral College doesn't actually advocate for the vote of these rural areas any more than abolishing the system or simply getting rid of the winner-take-all portion of it would as well. Also, the affirmative seems to miss the point of the negations argument, which is that the issues aren't within the operations of the Electoral College, but within the systemic implementation of it in the first place. We have to go back to the very roots of the system, which is that there was people that were worthy of voting and people that were not worthy of voting. These worthy people were, statistically speaking, white, educated, and landowning men. And because the system has gone unaltered through the course of history, we can still see the implications of this on minorities through disenfranchisement in voting today.
I think a major issue that the negative keeps on trying to stress here is that we have a continued system of unworthiness. You as a viewer, whether you're sitting at home, sitting in a library at school, wherever you may be, you are worthy to vote. There is nothing stopping you from casting your ballot, whether that's you choosing to wait in line at the polls, whether that's you choosing to mail in your ballot. There is fundamentally nothing that can stop you as a voter from casting your vote. Do not let the negative simply sit here all night and continue to talk about injustices that were started back when our country was created. We as a nation have moved past that. We have started to move forward in which we're starting to understand that those injustices in the past, they were wrong. And our current system should not reflect those injustices right now. we are starting to see more reforms in terms of our election system. More people are having expanded access. If we want to talk about disenfranchisement, we're actually seeing the exact opposite. Back in 2018, when the midterm elections actually happened, we saw that Georgia's minority turnout is the highest that it has ever been. It had a 40% turnout of minorities. And this was a state back in 2016 that was criticized for voter election disenfranchisement. But we see because of the proper systems that we have in place, such as the court system, we don't allow these injustices to happen anymore, but instead we move forward as a society and let people to use their right and vote for who they want to be in the presidential election.
I want to, does Meg want to respond? Because I have one last point that I want to make sure that we get to.
I would like to just add one little quick tidbit. Just going back to the Electoral College, the negative does not encourage you not to vote. Quite the opposite. We would love for everyone to vote. Minorities, majorities, anyone. We think that your vote matters. But we also would like to take a look at the system and the equality and equity of if your vote is as equal as everyone else's. So going back to the Electoral College, the affirmative acts like if we get rid of the Electoral College, they're assuming that these dense majority populations all vote the same way, and that, you know, the minorities or the rural areas, that their votes don't count anymore. But if we get rid of the Electoral College or go to a one-person, one-vote system, that gives equality for person-to-person voters, whereas the Electoral College right now, if you have if you're voting in a place like Wyoming versus California, statistically, due to the proportion of electoral votes to people, if you're in Wyoming, you get 3.6 more worth of a vote in the Electoral College than you would in California. So these systems are in place they have overprotected rural areas where people still don't get the same vote.
So I want to just very quickly throw my last question over to the negative, and I think this is an important note for us to end on, because I really want to make sure that we don't end up misconstruing exactly the point of our discussion tonight. So I'll throw it over to the negative. Obviously, you guys are arguing that our system is rigged, not fair, rather than fair, not rigged. Can you talk a little bit about why it is that is not a discouragement for people to go and vote? Why is it that you are in agreement that it's not necessarily a fair system, but that people should still go out and try and vote and cast their ballot?
I'm actually really glad you asked this question, Ted. So the reason why we can both acknowledge the system's flaws while still encouraging citizens to participate in their democracy, that's because the very participation in this democracy is what will provide solvency to the systemic issues that the negation and the affirmation have conceded exist. So what we're arguing here is that the audience at home, the wonderful voting eligible audience at home, should, if they've got the resources to, find ways to get informed about the issues on the ballot and pick candidates that accurately represent how they would like their political ideals to be displayed. And through that's the method by which we fix the system, through voting in itself, voting for those candidates that will work to abolish these voter IDs, that will work to reform the Electoral College as necessary in order for it to better encapsulate the views of the American public in equal and equitable ways. Among other things, to diminish the prevalence of super PACs in terms of funding our candidates, in terms of improving literacy rates in our lower funded education systems across the country, ensuring that we are electing people that will protect the values of American democracy, regardless of the broken system that we still follow today. That's the way we have to fix the system, and that's the justification that the negation makes. The voter essentially is the solvency we require in order to solve the broken system. All right,
and if the affirmative wants to respond, you're welcome to, and then we'll move to our closing statements.
I just find it interesting how you're encouraging people to go out and vote, which we 100% do. In doing so, you're almost acknowledging that the system is effective. These people can vote and their vote will matter, and it can create this change because the system is fair. The system itself is not rigged. If the system was rigged, then there wouldn't be a reason for them to vote, because then it wouldn't matter. these changes would not take place, because if it were true, what you believe, that the system is rigged, their vote won't actually create change. But since the system is fair, it will. So please do go out and vote, change these small problems that we have acknowledged, because we know that we are not perfect, but we know that our system is fair and can create lasting change when you participate in it.
The affirmative started in the closing statements, so if the negative wants to get the last word on the second round, you're welcome to, and then we'll move to Vincent from the affirmative.
I'm sorry, move into what?
I said we'll move into the last round, but since the affirmative is going first, the last round, if you guys want to get the last word right now, you're welcome to.
So I think what the affirmative is failing to understand is that we aren't saying the fundamentals of democracy are flawed, but we are saying the system put in place is flawed itself. The reason why voting is the solvency for this system is because we are able to vote for these candidates, or advocate, at least, even if it isn't through voting, if through public advocacy for candidates that will create the platform changes we need to see to make the election system more equitable and more equal, which are terms that both the affirmation and the negation used in their opening statements that I feel like haven't really been brought up. While the system may be equal, it certainly isn't equitable. And I'd like to remind the viewers at home that the difference between equity and equality is ensuring that marginalized and disenfranchised groups are receiving the assistance and aid they need to better be represented in our American democracy. So while it may be true that our democracy fundamentally isn't broken, we, the public that benefit from this system, need to be acting as advocates for those that are falling victim to the system that works to suppress their vote, which the negation has done a great job at proving. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. Anything else the negative wants to say, you can say in your closing statement. And again, thank you for an absolutely excellent, spirited second round. And now let's move into our third round. Again, we're going to have 2 to 3 minute closing statements from one of each of our debaters. And closing out for the affirmative, we have Vincent Jalapeno Hasso.
Good evening. Whether you are watching at home, on a TV, whatever it may be, I hope this was a lot more entertaining than the previous presidential debate right before our broadcast. But in today's debate, we have to focus on 2 main fundamental issues. First, the Electoral College, and second, the disenfranchisement of minority voters. Beginning with the Electoral College, what's important to understand is that the system that the Founding Fathers created was to ensure that there is representation all across America. If we were to get rid of the Electoral College, as I had brought up in questioning, that candidates would simply focus on major population centers, your New York, your Los Angeles, they'd simply begin to ignore the states in the core. And to counter Pat's point, in regards to candidates visiting states, actually that's far from the truth, because as the LA Times had reported, within the last 5 presidential elections, 34 states have been seen as swing states, or key battleground states. We don't simply see that a small portion of states are the ones that determine an entire election. What's important to understand, you as a voter, is that the Electoral College, no matter where you are, whether you are here in Arizona, whether you live in North Dakota, Michigan, New York, is that it provides the proper representation for your state. You get rid of the Electoral College and you don't have that representation anymore. You don't have representation if you live in the core. Your party politics nationwide are determined by cities such as New York or Los Angeles or other mega cities all along the East Coast. Vote in the affirmation because we provide representation not just for the mega city centers, but for all of the United States. Second, let's focus on the issue regarding the disenfranchisement of voters. Now, the negative throughout this whole entire debate keeps on saying that the system is against you if you're a minority. That's far from the truth. As we have seen that there were issues in the past, we do not disagree with that. But we have seen we get past those issues as a country. We go through the court system. We pass new legislation to empower minority groups, to ensure that this disenfranchisement doesn't exist anymore. They tried to cite studies from 2004, but as I brought up, a 2020 study from 2008 to 2016 showed that voter ID laws actually don't have an effect on voter turnout or voter registration. Do not fall for the beliefs of the negative in this debate, in which you as an American, whether you're a minority or not, that you are not going to be able to vote because of some sort of barrier. You have the right to vote, whether that's at the polls or by mail. And so I urge you to exercise your right to vote and vote in the affirmation of today's debate.
Thank you very much, Benson. And finally, closing out the entire debate, and obviously also the negative side of, again, the resolution that our election system is fair, not rigged. Arguing in the negative of that resolution, we have Pat Yango.
Once again, I would like to thank oh my god, I'm still muted. Once again, I would like to thank everyone who made this debate possible. Our moderator, Ted, our affirmative team, Vincent and Kat, for giving us great arguments, and Naya, my partner, and of course our guest speaker, Jack Nolan, and of course the wonderful viewers at home. To begin, I'd like to call back to a quote that was mentioned in the constructive speech of the negation. But it stated that the evils flow from the overexpression of our democracy. As Americans, we have to understand that democracy is what builds our country. It's the very foundations of what our country represents. And what democracy looks like is the ability to compromise and the ability to work towards solutions that benefit the American public holistically. Something that failed to go acknowledged by the affirmative team is that the Electoral College inherently only is representing the two-party system of the Democrats and the Republicans. And when we call back to the statistic that we mentioned again in our constructive, that 6 in 10 Americans feel as though their opinions are not represented by political parties today, it's becoming increasingly clear that not only is the current electoral system not representing the majority of Americans fairly, it simply isn't representing hardly anyone fairly. So what can we do to fix this problem? Simply put, we must vote. And the reason why is because as people that benefit from a system that has historically and presently put down minority voters, we ought to be using the platforms and abilities we have to be working towards solvency to fix the systemic issues that are ingrained within our electoral system. Something that, again, both the affirmative speakers have conceded to exist. Our point of debate isn't whether or not the system is working. Our point of debate is whether or not this working system is systemically flawed and systemically oppressive and systemically rigged. And through the examples of voter disenfranchisement, through super PACs, through the gerrymandering laws, through the voter ID requirements and the electoral colleges, we have proved that systemically speaking, this works to suppress those that the founders of this country simply did not see as worthy enough to vote. And in order for us to change this notion, we must vote not only in the negation, but in the upcoming election and elections afterwards to ensure that the foundations of our democracy are protected and that we are able to work towards more progressive change that benefits all American views equitably. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. All right, thank you so much for everyone who's viewing. Just a few announcements before you go. Again, we will announce the winner of this debate at our next debate, so please make sure that you vote, again, by clicking in the link below our Facebook description in our Instagram bio, or if you're watching this on YouTube, look at our YouTube description. You can vote there. But before and after, we will be announcing the winners of this debate, which are, again, decided by who ends up changing the audience's mind the most at our next debate on November 5th. And speaking of that, I'd like to say congratulations to Pavas Gupta and Emily Chrysanthus for winning our previous debate on the negative side of the resolution that cancel culture is an ineffective form of protest. Congratulations to them for winning our last debate, and we'll be announcing the winner of this debate on November 5th at our next debate, which will be Gun Rights Are Essential to a Free Society. Following that, we'll be talking to Stanley Fish on November 12th for an hour-long conversation on free speech, and our guest for our gun rights debate will be Adam Winkler, law professor at UCLA. It'll be great to have him here. Thank you so much again to Jack Nolan for joining us. Thank you for sticking around. We really hope that you are successful at getting as many people out to vote. Everyone, please go out and vote. It's a very, very important election. It's vital that you recognize that your vote counts, whether you think that the system is rigged or not, and this hopefully has proven it. So thank you again to all 4 of our debaters. You guys did an excellent job, and we will see you all in 2 weeks.